Please welcome U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson with Atlantic staff writer Clint Smith.
Quite a warm reception for you.
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to day 2 of the Atlantic Festival. It is a pleasure to be here with Justice Brown Jackson. And we have a limited amount of time, so we're gonna get started. We were talking backstage about how, the process of writing a book has been beneficial in all sorts of ways. And one of those ways you mentioned was that it's gotten you sort of out of the stuffy chambers into the world. Can you talk a little bit more about the experience of both writing the book, but also the experience of moving through the world with the book and how that's shaped your sense of how people are responding to you and the work and your story?
Yes, well, it's been a whirlwind, but amazing. I actually started writing the book just a little over 2 years ago, right after the confirmation. Because I was just grateful to have gotten through the process, and I wanted to pay tribute to the people and the circumstances that I felt were most responsible for that accomplishment. So the book is really a reflection on my life. I go back to my grandparents, my parents, and all of the mentors that I've had. And I've been so gratified by the reception that I've received as part of promoting a book, which I didn't know. I didn't know that I had to actually go out and...
they don't tell you when you sign up.
They don't tell you. You think you're just writing it and that's it. But putting it out into the world has been just so wonderful because I've been to a number of cities, seen a lot of people, different people who are telling me that they see me, that they understand, that they're interested in the court, perhaps in a way that they hadn't been before. And so I feel very pleased about that.
Yeah. One of the things that's so striking and moving about your memoir is the level of focus that it has on your childhood. You're very honest about aspects of your childhood in ways that may surprise some people. And I was particularly struck, especially at the beginning, by the way you talk about your relationship with race, and you talk about how, as a young person, you experienced a version of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, even when you didn't necessarily have the language for it at the time. Can you explain a little bit about what you meant?
So one of the things that happened to me as a young person is that I knew that I had stage presence. I knew that I could, talk to people. My mother, from when I was very little, put me in all kinds of public speaking competitions and things. And so I had the ability to sort of express myself, but I enjoyed mostly being alone. I was sort of an introvert. And I think, and I reflect on this in the book, that part of it was that I grew up in educational spaces that were predominantly white, and that I felt a lot the pressure of being one of a few and having to represent and having to be in a scenario in which I felt as though people were, wanting to know how Black people behave in these kinds of situations, and can she actually do the work? And I was a pleaser in terms of wanting to please my parents, wanting to do the best I could in every environment, and there was a lot of pressure. And so what I noticed was being alone was like, and I say this in the book, a soul deep sigh of relief, because I could just be myself and not feel the pressure to have to perform.
Did you feel that, even as a young child, did you feel this sense of having to perform, having to represent your race or your family in a particular way?
I mean, I think so. I think so. When you're, in an environment where you are one of a few, and especially given the sort of historical dynamics of race, which I was conscious of from a very young age. One of the things I've been saying in my book tour is that the significance of the timing of my birth cannot be overstated. And what I mean by that is that I was part of the first post-civil rights generation. I was born in 1970, which was within 5 or 6 years of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the end of Jim Crow segregation, which my parents had actually been subject to. And so when I was born, it was like a time of awakening and reopening for African Americans. My mother, my father were very conscious of their African American identity. They had gone to HBCUs and historically Black colleges and universities. And so they gave their daughter an African name. Ketanji Onyeka is the English translation of lovely, Ketanji Onyeka is the African for lovely one. My aunt was in the Peace Corps in Africa when I was born, and she sent my mother African names. And so this was part of their attempt to really infuse me with my cultural identity. But then I go to a bunch of predominantly white schools, and I feel very different in a way.
Speaking of the sort of, you talk a lot about the sort of intergenerational aspect of where your family has come from, you know, just as you've alluded to there. And there was a moment that I think illustrated the learning curve of this, because you're acutely aware of it now, and you were certainly growing up, but there was a moment in the book where you write about reading a note from your grandmother, and you didn't necessarily know that your grandmother had written the note at the time, but there were a lot of misspellings, a lot of words that weren't written correctly, a lot of letters not written correctly, and you laughed at the note. You thought it was really funny that whoever had written this note didn't know how to spell, didn't know how to write legibly. And your mom comes in, and she sees you laughing at this. And can you talk about what happens?
Oh, wow. I was in trouble. I was in trouble. I mean, you know, this was really a lesson in humility for me. My mother was crestfallen because she felt like she was raising me better than this. That, you know, she said something to the effect of, just because you know, have done so well on your spelling tests and you have all these opportunities, you're no bit better than anybody else who didn't have a chance to go to school. And I don't want you to go out into the world thinking that you're any better than anybody else. So you know, and I was devastated. Yeah. I cried all afternoon, and I apologized to my grandmother, who I don't even know knew what was really going on. Yeah. But it was really, it was a moment that has stuck with me throughout my whole life.
I think that's something that so many of us who come into some sort of relative success or positions of power or influence think about, is that sort of intergenerational impact. I mean, certainly I think of it in my case, my grandfather born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi. And I think about often also how, but to your point about that what is happening in your life is only possible in this moment. I think about the sort of arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance.
That's exactly
that made it so that, you know, there was one teacher who thought my grandfather, you know, was smart, and this is in a moment when there was no secondary education for Black people in Mississippi. And so he was picked from, you know, one out of however many primary school students there were, and he was sent to a different county. Because there was no high school for Black people in the county where he was raised, or where he lived and was raised. And so then he was sent off to a secondary school that gave him all manner of different opportunities that put our family in a position where we could build off of the sort of foundation that he was built. But I think often about how easily he could have not been picked by that principal.
So easy. And what it does is it makes me feel grateful. You know, I've only thought about being a judge, for example, because my father went back to law school when I was very little. And so I've thought about the law since I was, you know, 4 years old. But in middle school, I learned about Constance Baker Motley, who was the first African-American female federal judge. And the idea that there was a Black woman who could be a judge was like just transformational for me. But, you know, Constance Baker Motley could not have been appointed to the Supreme Court solely because of the time in which she was born. So it makes me feel just so extraordinarily grateful to be in this position.
One of the things you mentioned was that you were someone who liked to perform.
Yes.
And, you know, we can talk about performance and the sort of Du Boisian context of it, but we can also talk about performance in terms of the literal aspect of being on stage.
Yes.
And you, in your, I believe it was your college essay, in one of your supplemental college essays, you said, I want to be the first Black woman on the Supreme Court to also appear in a Broadway musical.
Yes.
And so, we got the first part. What I want to know is, are we going to get the second part?
Maybe with all of this touring, people keep asking me that, so I'm waiting for the right opportunity.
Is there a particular musical that, or Broadway show that you would love to star in? I'm sure we can make it happen.
You know,
we just send them
any of them. I love all manner of Broadway musicals. Are the best. Wicked. Love Wicked.
There we go. Wicked producers, wherever you are on the internet, now's your chance. But you grew up on stage. You did.
Yes.
You were in speech and debate, and the thing that you specifically focused on, your area of expertise, was a sort of oration that was piecing together different poems and plays.
There were two different things. So I did original oratory was my main event, and that is just writing your own speeches and memorizing them and delivering them. But then I also did something called dramatic and humorous interpretation, and that's where you take parts of plays, and it's like Anna Devere Smith does the one-woman show where you do all the different characters. It's like that.
How would you say that your experience as, I also want to be clear, you were like a theater kid. Like
I was
you loved theater, you loved being on stage. You loved it so much that you missed your high school graduation.
Yes.
Because you wanted to go to the national competition for the
and I was president of my class, so it was a big deal.
Yeah.
But I had to choose between hosting the graduation as class president or going to nationals in original oratory. And I did the right thing because I won.
There you go. There you go. How would you say the experience of being on stage, your experience in theater, to what extent, if at all, did it shape your sense of self, but also shape how you approach your work as a judge and a justice? You know,
some people have asked me that, and I wonder, you haven't really put this together before, but I wonder whether the ability to sort of embody other people and other worlds and have the perspective of others that comes from acting and being in theater was helpful in the work that I do as a judge. I mean, what we do is evaluate arguments that are being brought by different people about, what is, what should be. And in order to do that, I think having a wide range of experiences, whether they're your personal experiences or ones that you've learned about through something like theater, I think that's very helpful.
You went to Harvard. You were very involved in theater at Harvard. And after you graduated, you did not immediately go to law school. For a brief amount of time, you were a journalist.
Yes.
And so Jeff Goldberg is here somewhere. He's probably like, this is our chance. You know, the producers of Wicked are saying it's their chance. The editor-in-chief of The Atlantic is saying it's his chance. How did what was your experience in journalism like?
Well, it was very interesting. I loved it. I had a writing professor in college who wanted me not to go to law school. And then I had my dad, who was a lawyer, who said, you're absolutely going to law school. And so the compromise was that I applied to law school while I was in college, and I deferred a year, which is now pretty common, but back then wasn't all that common. And my writing professor arranged for me to do a year, he hoped longer, at Time Magazine. Okay. And it was really fun. I was in New York City, as a young person, and I'm knowing that I'm going to go to law school, so I didn't really have to do all the things, but I learned about journalism, and it was very interesting. And I love to write, so. Yeah.
You love to write.
I do.
I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but when you were a clerk, during one of your clerkships, this is a period of time, and we're going to go back to when you met your husband in a second, but there was a period of time in which I think you all were living in different cities because of he was in residency or fellowship somewhere, and you were doing your clerkship. And so after work, you had some time on your hands.
Yes.
And you said, as one does, you said, hey, I'm going to write a novel.
I tried.
So there's a Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson novel out there.
Maybe.
Somewhere. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was about, and if there's any hope that it might be pulled out of the drawer?
You know, it was so long ago. That was actually a very difficult time in my life, and maybe that's an impetus for writing, you know, when you're going through challenging periods. We had just gotten married, my husband and I, and then we had to be separated because he was doing his residency and I was at a clerkship in Providence, Rhode Island. And, you know, I just was feeling kind of down, and I said, let me try to put this into words. But it never really came together. I decided that writing a novel, I was much more of a nonfiction kind of person.
I think Random House might ask you to pull it out of the drawer,
yes,
just
they
so
might.
that they can see. But speaking of your husband, you all met in college.
We met in college.
And it was the origin story is funny because you all were in class together.
Yes.
And you were friends, and you were having conversations, and he would tap you on the shoulder, and you would have study groups, and we all knew. You know, it's funny reading it because it's like, oh, okay, study group. We know what this is. But there was a point where you had him in one of your classes, and he was so engaging and so kind and so thoughtful. And there was another class that he was in, or that you believed he was in, and you would see him, and he would ignore you.
Yes.
He would kind of like turn to the side.
Yes.
And you told your friends, and your friends were like, leave that guy alone.
Yes.
You don't want anything to do with him. But there was a twist.
There was a twist. So I said to them, my friends, you know, I'm going to confront him. I'm going to confront him on one of the friendly days because this is too crazy. So I say to him, you know, why don't you talk to me in our government class? And he says, I'm not taking a government class. And I said, yes, you are. I see you in the class. And he says, oh, you must be talking about my identical twin brother. And he absolutely has an identical twin brother. And I didn't know. So that's how we first met. Yes.
It feels like a line someone would use, but in this case, it's true.
It's true.
You all's relationship was really fascinating to read about because I think sometimes there can be these sort of overly reductive notions when you have, specifically around women who are in high-achieving jobs, really in these professional capacities. And there's this, are you going to lean in or are you going to lean out, right? And sort of an oversimplification of the seasonal nature of what it means to be in a partnership. Yes. And I think you all's partnership really reflects this idea of there are seasons to our personal and professional lives, and you all very much sort of, there would be periods of time in which you made your own professional and personal sacrifices to support him.
Absolutely.
And then periods of time where he did the same for you. Can you talk about how you all navigated that and then built your careers, had 2 children?
Yeah, well, it was not easy, but we were committed to having a true partnership in this way. And we met in college. We both knew we had significant professional interests. And we decided that we were going to do our best to try to get each other through the tough spots when we needed to. So what that meant was my husband is a surgeon, and he went to medical school and then went into residency as a surgeon. It's a very demanding period. And when he was doing that, there was a time in which I ended up getting a Supreme Court clerkship. I clerked for Justice Breyer. So he actually took a couple of years off in the middle of his residency, not off, but he did research, and his schedule got to be ratcheted back so that I could advance in terms of my doing the clerkship. And then after the clerkship, although I had wanted to stay in DC and start working right away here, he had to finish his residency. So we went back to Boston, and I kind of toggled back and let him finish his residency. And we did that sort of thing throughout our careers.
And this was the first person that you had dated.
Yes.
Because
yes.
you wrote very honestly in the book about how you didn't date in high school and how it was a similar experience that many of the Black women and Black girls in your school, it was a similar experience that they had.
Yes.
And this being at a predominantly, and I think it speaks to something that many Black women in
Yes.
predominantly white spaces experience, this feeling of a feeling unwanted,
Yes.
unseen, being undesired. And so much so that you were as you said, the president of your class, but you weren't going to go to prom.
No.
Because
even though I was planning it.
Even though
because no one asked me. But a friend ultimately said, you're planning everything. Who are you going with? You should go. We'll go together.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of my prom scenario.
Yeah. And so as you move forward and you met your husband, one of the things that was also interesting is that you had. Maybe not reservations, but there were questions about how each of your parents would respond to, your husband is white,
Yes.
how each of your parents and their vastly different histories and backgrounds.
Vastly.
Could you talk a little bit about the background of his family?
Yes.
How that shaped your wariness or anxiety or fear of how
Yes.
they may or may not accept you and your family?
So his family, if you've heard of this term, they are Boston Brahmins. And this is like a social group that can trace their lineage back to the Mayflower. My husband is 7th generation Harvard. And I had barely heard of Harvard before I applied. And I'm a descendant from slaves on both sides. My grandparents on both sides are from Georgia. And so I was concerned as we started to date and get kind of serious about what this meant for our relationship and whether or not, his family would accept me. I had no real basis for this because they're lovely people and it was fine, but I just had these notions of what it might mean to enter this kind of family. At one point, I knew that his grandmother, for example, had agreed to pay for his medical school. And I was worried that if she knew that he was dating a Black girl, that she might decide not to do that. And I had this, he was a letter writer when we were coming together as in our relationship. And I have this beautiful letter that he had written where he said something to the effect of, even if I have to take a job, even if I have to do something else, I choose you. I will always choose you. And so, that gave me some, the sort of strength of our bond gave me some comfort. But, my parents were concerned.
Yeah.
My parents, who thought he was lovely and, met him, again, you heard a little bit about my parents. And so when he actually went very traditionally to ask my parents for their blessing, because he wanted to ask me to marry him, my dad was like, look, have you talked this over with your family? Not so long ago, I don't know that I would even have you in my house, and not to mention asking my daughter to marry you. But, I've seen how the two of you have been. We dated for 7 years before we got married, and we've been married for 28 years now. But my parents ended up, coming around because they saw him and understood that his family was supportive of our relationship.
You can clap for that. Speaking of your family, one of the things that I think makes you particularly unique among so many things as a justice is your both personal and professional proximity to the criminal legal system. You worked as a public defender. Even before that, you worked with clients who were entangled in the criminal legal system, who were indigent, who were in and out of poverty. You also had a family member who themselves was incarcerated and serving a life sentence. I would love for you to talk a little bit about your uncle. This is your brother's.
This is my father's brother. Who I talk about in the book.
Yeah.
So we growing up were much closer to my mother's side of the family. She had a very supportive 5 brothers and sisters, really strong family. My father was raised essentially by a single mother. He basically raised himself. He too had 4 brothers and sisters, but not really close. And one of his older brothers got sort of wrapped up in drugs and was, this is the year, a freshman in college. And I knew my uncle from around, but he got involved in basically a drug courier operation. And I talk about it in the book. I don't find this out for years later. So in the book, I talk about having discovered these details. But essentially, he was pulled over after going into a drug house and taking out some drugs. And the police were surveilling the premises and just followed him and then arrested him. And he had enough drugs in his possession that it triggered very, very substantial penalties. And he was within 6 months of the enactment of the federal 3 strikes law. And so he got a life sentence. And I didn't know this until I was a federal public defender, and he called me. This is maybe 15 years after he was incarcerated. And I'm a defender. My dad tells him I'm a defender, and he decides to call me from jail. And wanted me to review his records and see if there was anything that could be done in his case. And I knew I couldn't help him because I wasn't in his jurisdiction. I'm not his lawyer, but I looked at the records and discovered all of this. And I talk about it in the book because it's a very kind of significant experience, not only for me, but for our country in terms of how we handle situations like this. But eventually I turned his records over to a friend who took his case pro bono, and years later I find out that he is among the last group of defendants who are pardoned by President Obama on his very last tranche of people, which I find out by looking on the website like everybody else to see if he'd gotten any relief. And it was pretty extraordinary. He served 28 years. And he was 70 some odd years old when he was arrested at 50. So it was very tragic, and he died a year later. He was out for less than a year. So it was very informative in a lot of ways, but you say proximity. One of my favorite quotes is from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who says that the life of the law is not logic, it is experience. And so having experienced all of these things, I think really gives me an interesting perspective on the law.
Yeah. And what about the public defender piece? Like, how does the experience, because it is not often the case, many of our judges at the highest level and justices often come from a prosecutorial background.
They do.
How did the experience of being a federal public defender shape your perspective and how you think about what you do and how you engage on the court?
Well, I think that it probably had the most impact at the trial level. So I was the trial judge for the longest period of time, 7 years, before becoming a Court of Appeals judge and then getting onto the Supreme Court. And as a trial judge, you actually interact with criminal defendants. You are trying cases, you are sentencing people. And I think that my perspective from having represented indigent criminal defendants really shaped how I communicated with defendants who came into my courtroom. One of the things I noticed as an appellate defender, which is what I was that my clients really didn't understand what had happened to them in the system. They couldn't really help me with the project of evaluating their trials. And I was like, you've just gone through the most consequential thing in your life and you don't know. And it was because people weren't explaining to them. People weren't talking to them. People weren't treating them with respect. And what was happening is that they then were having a hard time taking responsibility for what they had done. What you want, I think, in the criminal justice system is for people to if they have to go to jail, to actually go in and come out and reform, to go in and reflect on the terrible thing that happened and vow not to do it again. And there's a blockage that happens for people when they go in and they actually spend most of their time talking about how victimized they were or feeling like the system didn't treat them well, because then they can't really do the work to change their behavior. So I used that in my thought process and my procedures with criminal defendants as a trial judge, communicating with them, using their names. Sometimes judges just call people defendant, explaining every step of the process so that there was no confusion as to what was going on. And I thought that was very important, and it was a lesson that I learned from being a defender.
You also write so beautifully about your children.
Yes.
And your oldest, you also write very honestly about the difficulty of some of the difficulties your oldest daughter experienced, having been diagnosed with autism. And you write very movingly and honestly in ways that I think any parent, whether or not you have an autistic child or not, will appreciate in terms of what it means to find the best school, the best support to accommodate what your child needs. And I encourage everybody to, this is one of the most moving parts of the book. There is a period toward the end of the book, a passage toward the end, where you basically have your younger daughter's college essay, which I gotta say is like the best college essay I've ever read. Like I was
She's
like, is she a novelist? Like,
She's a great writer.
It was unbelievable.
Yeah, she's a great writer.
And she was writing about her relationship with her sister.
Yes.
And it was so remarkable. I wish we had the book here so I could just read it out loud. But what did that mean to you?
Yeah.
Because it's not, it was difficult for her.
It was very difficult. I mean, one of the things that happened in my family, and sometimes I think happens in a lot of families where you have neurodiversity or you have some issue with one child, is that it takes so much focus to try to stabilize them and to support them and to help them, that if there are other children, they sometimes feel like, kind of off to the side. And then the relationship between the two of them can be complicated as a result. And so it was just fascinating to me because my daughter wrote this essay and it was revelatory of the perspective of the other child in a situation like that. So I thought she gave me permission to put it in the book because I just thought it was so wonderful. And if we were going to talk about this experience as a family, I wanted her perspective to be reflected as well.
And if you're an audiobook person, she reads it herself
She does.
in the book. And it blew me away. I listened to it 5 times. I was just like, 17-year-old wrote this?
She is extraordinary.
I was like, is she Toni Morrison? What is going on? So now you're on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
There we go. And, certainly the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, periods of time in history, how lucky and fortuitous it is, you also spoke it into existence. Like you were, just as you have spoken Broadway into what will exist. I'm curious what the experience of, what's something that surprised you about the court?
I think something that surprised me is how formal the court is, even behind the scenes. I had clerked on the court, so there wasn't a whole lot about it that was new, but the spaces in which the justices are by themselves, it's just interesting to me. So we shake hands with every other justice before every argument and before every conference, and it's just sort of like a formality. When we're in conference, we speak in a certain order and vote in a certain order. It's very kind of formal and traditional in a way that I was not anticipating. It's the junior justice, not anticipating.
And as we wrap up, because we have so many great conversations coming up after us, but I'm curious what it feels like to step into a position, such a historical position in this way. When I told my parents and grandparents that I would be interviewing Justice Brown Jackson, it it meant so much because you mean so much to so many people, to Black people, to women, to Black women, to, what does it feel like to occupy that position, to be, that your position, that your identity, that you are almost bigger than you?
It's extraordinary. I mean, I again, all I can say is that I feel grateful every day to be able to serve the American people in this way, that I know that I didn't do it on my own, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, because I wanted people to see the influences. And I hope that I can inspire other young girls who are thinking about the law to do big things, because I feel like I'm just so fortunate to be here.
Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.